Hey, welcome everybody. It's Mr. Biggles. So what I wanted to do today is show you a little bit how to read graphs, because you know what? Everybody wants to say I'm never going to use math again in my life. I guarantee you're going to have to read a graph someday or other. So it doesn't really matter what you're going to be learning. You're going to have graphs involved. Now, when looking in graphs, there's a couple things we want to do. One thing, before we even start analyzing any information, we want to see if there's a type. Sometime on graphs, especially outside of mathematics, there's a lot of things that we title, and that's going to tell us what we're going to be looking at. Now this one says star trips versus hats. Don't really know what that means, but it's the title. This one says time on the computer. Well, alright, that kind of makes sense. That means I'm going to be learning about time spent on a computer. Now the next thing we need to understand about a graph, and especially these types of graphs, is that we're going to have two sets of values. What we have is we have two axes, okay, or two sets of data. And that two sets of data, what happens is combined onto one sheet, which we call the graph. So along this edge, all right, which we're going to call the x-axis, just getting a little ahead of ourselves, but along this edge, what we have is what we call the games played. So what this means is this is the number of games played. So you can look at every single unit. You can see each one of these tick marks is going to be a unit. Now, there's a couple things to notice. One thing is we understand that these are the number of games played. The next thing is we need to understand how much is it changing between each unit. Well, between each one of these units, we're changing going up by 5. So that's very important for us to understand that each one of these is going up by 5 units. So then on the vertical axis, which we call the y-axis, we can see this is the number of games won. So these numbers right here represent the number of games won, where now these units are, instead of going up by 5s, these are going up by 10s. So that's very important for us to be able to understand when we're reading the graph. So let's say I wanted to find this value. I wanted to understand, what does that mean? Why do we have that point up there? What does that mean? Well, first of all, what I'll do is I'm going to look over and say how far on this axis is that point at. You can say it's over about 10 and go up, and it's also about 30. So I could say my point, which we'll get into this more later, but we have 10 come 30. That means I had 10 games played, and at 10 games played, we won 30 games won. So that point represents two sets of data that when we bring them together, we can say when he or she played 10 games, they won 30. So that's very important, and we can do that for the rest of this graph. Now, another set of graph that I want to look at is just a bar graph, just to kind of help us kind of determine how to read the graphs. Well, for this graph, it says hours per week. That's on your vertical axis. So that means these numbers, which are going up by 1s, means the number of hours somebody is on the computer. Why did I know it was on the computer? Well, that was the title, the time on the computer. So the hours per week on the computer. Then on my x-axis is the number of boys and girls. So I can see that boys, when I go and read this, so the number of hours boys are on the computer, the time for boys would be 5 hours, and the time for girls looks like it's going to be about 7 hours. Sorry, I made these up. So you could say boys represented roughly around 5 hours on the computer, and girls roughly represented 7 hours on the computer. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much just a basic rundown of how to read graphs. Check the title, check both of the axes to understand, make sure you know the intervals, how they're changing, and then read the points that are given on there and make an understanding of the graph. Thanks again. See you guys later.